I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. Welcome in, folks. Week 17. This is Fantasy Championship week. It's the start sit show. Let's get right into it. I've got starts. I've got sits. I've got 5 underdog fantasy picks for the good people. We're recording this on Friday morning. We had 2 Christmas games. We had a Thursday night game. We have 3 Saturday games. It is important to be vigilant, to stay up with the news. I'm here to help. Let's get right down to it. At quarterback, start Kyler Murray. Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 12 at the Rams. I recommended him as a start last week. Good job, Josh. 21 fantasy points. This week, he has the 8th best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks against the Rams when you adjust for quality of opponents faced. Rams Cardinals game total is high this week. 48.5 points, very high. The Cardinals are also 5.5 point underdogs. They're going to have to do some throwing. They're going to have to use Kyler. I think it's going to be a very high scoring divisional affair. I'm looking forward to it. Stream Drake Maye. Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 21 versus the Chargers. Now, Maye has had 18 or more fantasy points in 4 of his past 5 games. The only game he didn't reach 18 fantasy points during that span was the Dolphins. They are the second toughest matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. The Chargers are an average matchup. But Drake Maye, he's fifth among quarterbacks this year with 35 rushing yards per game, just behind Jalen Hurts and just ahead of Kyler Murray. So this gives him a decent floor. And the reason I also think it's apt to mention Jalen Hurts, we are monitoring the situation around the clock. I have interns awake 24/7 at Jalen Hurts' house right now, trying to see whether or not he will play from his concussion and finger injury. It's mostly a concussion. I don't think the finger injury that they're mentioning, all that matters. But hey, some of you need Jalen Hurts replacements. Drake Maye is not a bad option. Stream Mason Rudolph. Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 25 at the Jaguars. Now, the Jaguars are actually the number 1 matchup to target for fantasy quarterbacks. I do all the work on matchups each week. When I adjust for quality of quarterbacks faced, quarterbacks score 4 fantasy points above their season-long average against the Jaguars. So if a quarterback's averaging 16 fantasy points a game, we would expect them to score 16 plus 4, 20 fantasy points against the Jaguars. That's great. Mason Rudolph has 16 fantasy points in 4 straight games, 240 passing yards or more in 3 of his past 4, and he's got sneaky mobility. He has at least 4 rush attempts in all but 1 game this year. Running back. We've got some gross names. We got some fun names here. I had him as a sit last week. I was wrong. I was wrong about Jerome Ford. Start Jerome Ford this week. Running back 18 versus the Dolphins. I was so surprised last week. He was awesome. 11 carries, 92 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Caught all 5 targets for 39 yards through the air. That's pretty insane usage. Great for him. I think this is the type of quick passing, run-heavy offense Cleveland will operate once again versus the Dolphins. I see Ford as having a decent floor this week based on usage, particularly in PPR formats. Start Tyrone Tracy. Consensus running back 18 versus the Colts. We've gone back and forth on Tracy. I think I'm going to pat myself on the back. We took an L on Ford last week. I've generally been pretty spot on with when to start and sit Mr. Tracy this year. Feels like a start versus the Colts. Colts, top 10 matchup for fantasy running backs. Tracy has at least 28 receiving yards, 4 of his past 5 games. He's kind of like Ford this week. He's a decent floor play in PPR for fantasy managers that are preparing to not have somebody like Alvin Kamara this week. And the Colts do allow 2 fantasy points per game above players' season-long average. So if Tracy's been averaging, say, 12 fantasy points a game, we expect that closer to 14 against the Colts. Can't believe I have to say this, but folks, start James Conner. Fantasy Pros consensus running back 40 at the Rams. He's not going. That's just because a lot of people assumed him out. I think that's why he's at running back 40. He's not really ranked by people there. But let me say this. So he's been limited in practice all week since Tuesday. He plays Saturday. Since Tuesday, he's been limited. If he's playing, which I think he is, you have to start him. And generally, if players are limited or better in every single practice of the week, just up and down, up and down the week, they play. He's been the running back 11 in fantasy points per game this year. He's been the overall fantasy RB1 over the past 3 weeks. I've just seen so many people talking themselves out of him all week. I'm personally going to fire him up and not overthink it. My fantasy rankings are on Twitter at JLarkyTweets, on Blue Sky at Josh Larky. I will be updating those either later tonight, Friday, or I guess this afternoon, Friday, or tomorrow, early morning, Saturday. I will update them. I will update them for the good people. James Conner's been ranked highly all week. Just accept it. Just take it. Some people were trying to start random dudes that they were like, oh, like, can I just flex random player who stinks because he plays on Wednesday or Thursday? And I was like, no. James Conner, he's playing. He's playing on Saturday. Just relax. He's been in my rankings the whole time. Take a deep breath. But yeah, make sure you check those out. I will be plucking CeeDee Lamb, who is out for the rest of the season. I will make a lot of other updates. Stay tuned. If you need a desperation start at running back, hello, Ameer Abdullah, consensus running back 36 on Fantasy Pros at the Saints. The Raiders have heavily utilized Ameer Abdullah in recent weeks. God, I just love saying Abdullah. The doula. It's the strong D sound. Producer, do not clip that. That is out of context. The strong D. Abdullah. I love it. Ameer Abdullah. Over 19 fantasy points in week 15. Over 19 fantasy points in week 16. I'm not going to say league winner, but I think it's pretty good. He has 12 catches over his last 2 weeks. He even had 7 carries, 38 yards, and a touchdown last week. So they gave him some carries, and he actually performed much better than Alexander Mattison. In PPR leagues, he's a desperation start. He may be able to keep the momentum going against a Saints team that looks like one of the NFL's true bottom feeders. The Raiders already won last week versus the Jaguars. They nuked their draft pick. Raiders were in contention for pick 1. If you look, they are now projected to have the 6th pick. What are they doing? But at this point, I think they try to steamroll the New Orleans Saints. Passes to Ameer Abdullah have been fairly efficient the last few games. And I think they can keep it going. The Saints are just a defense to target for your fantasy running backs. Why not Ameer Abdullah? If you need 8, 10 fantasy points in PPR, and hey, you might get 19 for a 3rd straight week. Wide receiver. Start. Lad McConkey, wide receiver 16 at the Patriots. I don't care. Producers in my ear like, hey, you recommend Lad McConkey almost every week. It's because people rank him too low. And let's just talk about it. We'll be really quick. The Patriots are not a good slot matchup on paper. It's not great. I get it. But the Chargers have been playing Lad McConkey. Shh, don't tell anybody. They've been playing him slightly more on the outside in these situations recently. If it's a better outside matchup than slot matchup, Lad McConkey plays about 30% of the time outside. They just want to get the guy targets. The kid's undeniable. There's not much target competition with the Chargers. He's catching passes from Justin Herbert. Rookie wide receivers generally improve as the season moves along. Lad McConkey has been on an absolute tear the past 8 games. 5.5 catches, 87 yards, 16.5 fantasy points per game. He has essentially been a low-end fantasy wide receiver 1 the past 2 months. And I keep bringing him up on the show because you probably drafted him in the 8th, 9th, 10th round. You're going to have other options to consider at wide receiver. I simply start him every week. I don't think about it. Lad McConkey is in my lineup. Start. Garrett Wilson, Fantasy Pros consensus wide receiver 25 at the Bills. I know that the Garrett Wilson fantasy managers are annoyed by Davante Adams fantasy points. I've been there. This guy right here, I'll admit it. I do not have Davante Adams on my fantasy teams. I was not drafting Davante Adams on the Raiders. He luck boxed into Aaron Rodgers. I was drafting Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson was awesome. The usage it's still been there for Garrett Wilson. I have to fire him up in a couple leagues this week, and I'm optimistic because I just don't get impatient. Don't sit him this week. So, if you read the press conferences, if you check the news like I do, there's some real chance that the Buffalo Bills rest their starters after the first half. Head coach Sean McDermott was asked about this, and he even kind of alluded to considering that. They did it, I forget if it was last year or 2 years ago, but the Bills have done this in the past. When they even a couple weeks early, when there's not much to play for, Kansas City's locked up the number 1 seed. The Bills might be resting some starters. And Garrett Wilson over his past 4 games, when you've been frustrated with Garrett Wilson over his past 4 games, he has still averaged over 8 targets, over 5 catches, 66 yards per game. We could very well see a Garrett Wilson eruption spot versus an injured Bills defense in the first half. Then he goes nuclear against the backups in the second half. Keep the faith. Start Calvin Ridley. Consensus wide receiver 28 at the Jaguars. Jaguars rank 5th, plus 2.6 for outside receivers. If you want all of my fantasy matchups, J Larky tweets on Twitter, Josh Larky, Blue Sky. You can see all my matchups for every single player, quarterback, running back, receiver, slot, receiver, outside, tight end, fantasy defenses, kickers even. I have the matchups. Check them out. Jaguars are the 5th best matchup for outside receivers. Outside wide receivers score over 2.5 fantasy points above their season average against the Jaguars. I get it. Chigoziem Okonkwo has been getting the recent attention with Mason Rudolph, 10 or more targets in back-to-back games. But hey, 3 weeks ago, Calvin Ridley had 12 targets against the Jaguars. 7 catches, 59 yards, no touchdown. If he gets the touchdown there, that's 20 fantasy points, roughly. No one says anything. They're just like, thank you, Calvin Ridley. I think we get the targets once again. It's an elite matchup, and we're going to cross our fingers that we get the touchdown with Calvin Ridley. Start Jacobi Meyers. Consensus wide receiver 31 at the Saints. Jacobi Meyers let us down last week. 5 targets, 2 catches, 41 receiving yards, and a good matchup. But before that, here were his target totals the past 4 games. We're just going to ignore one bad game when Brock Bowers was just undeniable. He went off. He was just peppered. He had over 10 catches. Here were Meyers' target totals. 9, 10, 11, 15. Just before that. The 4 games before that. I like the Raiders. They're gonna beat the rudderless Saints team. They're gonna pour on the points. Like I mentioned before with Ameer Abdullah, the Raiders already won last week. They nuked their 2025 draft pick. It went from pick 1 to pick 6. What are they doing? Saints are a slightly above average matchup, whether Meyers is lining up out wide or in the slot. Start Adam Thielen. Consensus wide receiver 36 at the Buccaneers. 8 catches, 99 yards and a touchdown. The last time the Panthers faced the Buccaneers on December 1st, he has at least 5 catches. Double-digit fantasy points his past 4 games. Since he returned from injury in his past 4 games, since he got up to speed, Adam Thielen has averaged 8.5 targets, 7 catches, 74 yards. That's 17 fantasy points per game. That's fantasy wide receiver 1 numbers right there. Start Jalen McMillan. You need upside. He's on a lot of benches. I'm flexing him in a league myself. Fantasy Pros consensus wide receiver 39 versus the Panthers. So hey, DFS enthusiasts, a little Thielen McMillan correlation there. Maybe it's pretty cheap. That's pretty cheap upside right there. McMillan has averaged 7 targets, 5 catches, 64 yards per game over his past 3 games. That's 11 fantasy points per game right there. Oh, and he scored 4 touchdowns over his past 3 games. Yeah, add that in. Now we're at 20 fantasy points a game over his past 3. The Panthers in general have struggled against outside receivers this year. The Buccaneers are 5th in the NFL in points per game, 4th in passing yards per game, 3rd in passing touchdowns per game. This is an awesome pass attack. McMillan is the wide receiver 2. He is your upside dart throw. If you want to flex play for your fantasy championship at tight end, we're starting David Njoku, consensus tight end 9 versus the Dolphins. Now, the Browns offense is likely going to funnel through the running backs and tight ends to accommodate Dorian Thompson-Robinson's skill set. Dorian Thompson-Robinson. Oh, I can't say his name. He totaled 74 yards last week to tight ends, 42 yards to running backs, just 41 yards to receivers. Dorian Thompson-Robinson is borderline incapable of throwing downfield. 4.6 air yards per pass attempt last week versus the Bengals. The guy had 0 passes, that traveled 20 plus air yards downfield out of his 34 pass attempts. DTR was the only quarterback last week that didn't even attempt a 20-yard pass. Unbelievable. Miami's an above average pass defense overall. Now, the Browns offense, it's going to funnel through the running back like Jerome Ford and the tight ends like David Njoku. This is how you accommodate DTR's just terrible skill set. Terrible for the NFL. What are they doing? Trotting him out again. Njoku had 10 targets last week. He caught 8 passes for 66 yards. 10 targets. Nobody else on the team had more than 5 targets. Miami's actually a slightly above average matchup for fantasy tight ends when you adjust for opponents faced. So it's a good matchup for tight ends. Terrible matchup for receivers. It's DTR. We're feeling good if we have Njoku in the finals this week. Stream Chigoziem Okonkwo at the Jaguars. Just do it. 10 targets last week, or 10 targets 2 weeks ago. 8 catches, 59 yards. Last week, 11 targets, 9 catches, 81 yards. Mason Rudolph loves throwing to the guy. Jaguars are +2 PPR, 7th best for fantasy tight ends. That means when you adjust for their opponents, you adjust for how good the tight ends are that they played, they score 2 fantasy points above what you expect, above their season-long average. We like Chigoziem Okonkwo once again this week.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins-Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson had 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Josh Larky. This is Dominator. Let's get right to it. We've done the starts. Let's do the sits. And we got 5 underdog fantasy picks. No sits at quarterback this week. I don't know what to tell you. You want me to manufacture them? I'm not going to do that. I don't have any, but I have 2 running back sits. I'm sitting in a couple leagues this week, actually. Brian Robinson, running back 15 versus the Falcons. So I don't hate him last week the same way that I did versus Philly the week before, but I don't think he should be the running back 15. And I will say this. I will take the L. I did not like Jaden Daniels last week. That was a huge L. The Commanders' offense had 5 turnovers. That's kind of what I was afraid of, is that it would be an ugly game. But hey, Jalen Hurts gets concussed after 11 passing yards. Kenny Pickett is Kenny Pickett. The dynamics of the game, they changed a little bit, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, Jaden Daniels scored fantasy points. I had him ranked quarterback 8. You probably started him. A few of you out there might have had someone that I ranked in the top 7 ahead of him. For that, I apologize. I own that. I did that. It was wrong. Anyway, Brian Robinson, we got that right. All right. Okay. So he plays the Falcons. The Falcons defense is so beatable through the air. So beatable. But they've been strong against the run this season. The Falcons have allowed 4 rushing touchdowns all year to running backs. 4 rushing touchdowns allowed by the Falcons. It's because the run defense is not half bad, and teams just want to throw in the red zone against the Falcons. The Falcons are just begging teams to throw against them. They're so terrible as a pass defense. While running backs average nearly 6 receptions per game against the Falcons, Brian Robinson isn't really the exact archetype to take advantage of that fully. He's not really this high volume pass catching back. So the Falcons, when you look at their fantasy points against, you're like, oh, they're bad, but it's not the worst matchup. And it's like, oh, it's because of some pass catching running backs have had explosive weeks against them. Brian Robinson does not really feel like that type of back. I think this team throws. I think this team wins. That's why I've been on Underdog Fantasy, these playoff best ball tournaments, why I, in the late rounds, occasionally take a Mike Evans, a Bucky Irving, a Jalen McMillan, a Baker Mayfield. I think the Buccaneers will win this division and will play home field in the playoffs for their first week. It's because I don't think the Falcons win this week against the Commanders, but I do think the Buccaneers win this week against the Panthers. Sit Kendre Miller, consensus running back 27 versus the Raiders. I do not want anything to do with this Saints offense. You can't make me. 8 carries, 15 yards, 2 receptions, 16 yards last week against the Packers. I just don't see how sitting him burns you. Personally, me, Josh Larky, I have Kendre Miller. When you look at my fantasy rankings on Twitter at JLarkyTweets, I have him outside my top 35 right now. Do I think he's going to finish inside the top 35? Probably. He's probably going to finish like RB 31. I just don't see the true fantasy upside. I'd rather start someone that has true 16, 18, 20 fantasy point upside. I don't see that with Kendre Miller. This offense is so bad with Spencer Rattler. So bad. Now turning to receiver. Sit. Wide receiver DeVonta Smith. Wide receiver 30 versus the Cowboys. This is assuming Jalen Hurts won't play now with the concussion. Last week, Kenny Pickett threw for 143 yards on 24 attempts. 15 targets for A.J. Brown. That was fun. I don't want to do math on air, but 15, 24. That is over a 60% target share. You're welcome for that math. It's about 61%? You can fact check that. It's just over 60% of a target share. 15 targets, 24 attempts. DeVonta Smith, 8 targets. That's a 33% target share. It's still great, but 6 catches, 51 yards. I don't know. It's a 1-game sample, but let me tell you this. Here is why I don't like DeVonta Smith. I think A.J. Brown is the alpha. I know A.J. Brown is the alpha. The non-wide receiver 1 for a Kenny Pickett offense is a tough sell for fantasy football. We've seen this show for about 25 games, 30 games before. You do not want to start the non-wide receiver 1 in a Kenny Pickett offense. I just don't see the spike week incoming for DeVonta Smith. We have to zoom out and say, A.J. Brown, Kenny Pickett's wide receiver 1. DeVonta Smith, not Kenny Pickett's wide receiver 1. It's tough sledding. It's tough sledding. We're doing it again. We sat him last week. We're sitting him this week. Sit Jerry Jeudy. Consensus wide receiver 41 versus the Dolphins. You simply cannot start Cleveland receivers. Cannot start Cleveland receivers with Dorian Thompson-Robinson at quarterback. I'll mention it one more time because it's hilarious. DTR had 74 passing yards to tight ends, 42 yards to running backs, 41 passing yards to receivers. Was the only quarterback last week to not attempt a pass of 20 air yards. He was the only quarterback who didn't even throw downfield one time last week. Miami's a well above average defense against receivers. Don't do it. Start Dalton Kincaid. Sit Dalton Kincaid. Sit Dalton Kincaid. Consensus tight end 15 versus the Jets. He's ranked outside the top 12 by consensus. But the reason I'm talking about him is I looked on Sleeper. He's being started right now in 49% of Sleeper leagues. He's topped 32 yards once in his past 5 games. I already mentioned the Bills might even rest starters at the half. And the Jets have been one of the best teams this year against fantasy tight ends. They've been the 6th toughest team against fantasy tight ends when you adjust for opponents faced. Folks, we did it. Let's talk some Underdog fantasy picks. We hit the starts, we hit the sits. It's week 17. It's title town. This is why we do this. So I went 4 for 4 on the show last week. We 10x'd our picks. If anyone else was following along, I've got a 14.22x. I don't know how Underdog determined that payout. It's because I have correlation, I guess. 14.22x. If we hit these 5, 3 of them super correlated. Let's get down to it. Calvin Ridley, higher than 23.5 yards longest reception. He's been higher than that in 8 of his past 10 games. He's 8-2 in his past 10. He caught a 30-yard pass when they faced Jacksonville a few weeks ago. I like it. Mason Rudolph, higher, 226.5 passing yards. He's had 240 or more 3 of his past 4. Correlates a little bit with the Calvin Ridley line. Jacksonville's allowed the most passing yards per game to fantasy quarterbacks. They're allowing like 270 passing yards per game. It's amazing. It's amazing. I think Mason Rudolph gets there himself. And we also have the benefit of Tony Pollard still being a little bit banged up. In pressers, head coach Callahan of the Titans was basically saying that the reason they've played more Tajay Spears recently is because Pollard is a little banged up. And I think that bodes well for the passing game. And then one more from the passing game there. Chigoziem Okonkwo, higher, 37.5 receiving yards. He hit the longest reception over last week that we liked with Okonkwo. We're going right back to him with his receiving yards. At least 10 targets, at least 59 receiving yards, back-to-back games. Rudolph's favorite target. Great matchup versus Jacksonville. We like it. 2 more picks. These aren't correlated, but we like them. Jerome Ford, higher, 17.5 receiving yards. Over this number in his past 4 games. Over this number 5 of his past 6. He had 5 catches, 39 yards last week versus the Bengals with DTR at quarterback. I mean, even Pierre Strong had 2 receptions in that game. DTR is a check down merchant. And then finally, Jalen McMillan, higher than 40.5 receiving yards. At least 4 catches, at least 57 receiving yards and 3 straight. The matchup versus Carolina is the 8th best for outside receivers like McMillan. I think the rookie continues his late season surge in a must-win game for the Buccaneers playoff hopes. You take the Calvin Ridley longest reception higher, Mason Rudolph and Chigoziem Okonkwo yardage hires, Jerome Ford receiving yards higher, Jalen McMillan receiving yards higher. Put those 5 together, that is a 14.2x on Underdog Fantasy. Folks, that'll do it for the Week 17 Start Sit Show. I'm Josh Larky, at JLarkyTweets on Twitter, at Josh Larky on Blue Sky. I will be updating my fantasy rankings soon for the good people out there. I've got all my matchups charts there as well if you're looking for it. Stay tuned for everything Player Profiler. Stay tuned for everything Underdog Fantasy, the sponsor of this show. Folks, I got to get out of here. It's Friday. I've got my dinosaur mug. I've got my coffee. It's time to take down some fantasy championships. Thank you for rocking with me this entire season. As far as I'm aware, the show will go on where we're doing contract renegotiations right now. I would love to keep podcasting for Player Profiler. I assume I will keep podcasting for Player Profiler. Matt brought me into the industry. He is probably, maybe, certainly the best guy out there when it comes to being an innovator with different products, with just the general way that he sees this industry. I love it. I love it. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.